first time I met Dom Cummings, and he said, is this the way that we should be doing modern government? Is the complex security decisions and the very difficult trade-offs between offensive advantage and protective security. Inclined to innovation, my risk threshold is high, are really interesting topics about which I feel passionately.
Hello and welcome to the Creative Tech Podcast, where we discuss how technology can help you to be more creative. This podcast is made by the National Centre for Creativity Enabled by AI, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we call it CBE for short. It's presented by the Director of CBE, Professor Maiden. Neil, who's in the studio today?
Today I am delighted to talk with someone who I've known and respected for most of my professional life. Sir Professor Anthony Finkelstein, CBE, is the current president of City University of London. He has a long and distinguished career as a computer scientist, one that has specialised in developing new methods and tools for software engineering. His research has been recognised many times over. For example, he is an elected Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and an appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire for services to computer science and engineering. Moreover, from 2015 to 2021, Anthony was Chief Scientific Advisor for National Security to Her Majesty's government here in the United Kingdom. And one of his undoubted professional highlights was the opportunity to act as the external examiner on my PhD back in 1992. Anthony, good morning. How are you?
I'm fine. I like the have known and respected, because you could always say, I've known him for a long time and respected him for some of it, which would be a good way to start.
Well, no, I think that's unfair. I don't have to make things up. It's my podcast. I can say whatever I like in the sort of spirit of right-wing jocks. Where are you today, Anthony?
Well, today's unfortunately a public transport strike in London, and so I'm camping at the headquarters of Universities UK, where I'm undergoing a training session today for new university presidents, which should be interesting. I don't know what it involves, catering contracts and firefighting and mortal combat with the weaponry of your choice. I'll learn a bit more later.
Well, I think you should let the city staff know that you go on these training courses. It might act as a bit of a spur for the rest of us to go on our heavy lifting of objects courses and so on, which we often try and put off. Do you get much of a chance to go back into academic research in computer science and software engineering? Do you miss that if you are not able to?
Actually, it's quite interesting because my career's gone a bit in phases. So when I was a head of department at UCL, I got a fair amount of time still to keep up with my research in the area. And I think that faded a little bit when I was Dean of Engineering. But then when I became a Chief Scientific Advisor, I actually got a lot of applied technological challenges. And I really enjoyed that mixture of strategy, but also, problem solving, really satisfying. Since I've started as president, I'm quite worked out what I'll be able to manage and what I won't be able to manage. But I actually have started a really enjoyable bit of technical collaboration, actually with an economist, which has proved really fascinating. And it's on security decision-making, how you make complex security decisions and the very difficult trade-offs between offensive advantage and protective security. And it's a great mixture of all of my interests. So I'm quite excited. If tech isn't a part of what I do, then I really miss it.
This new project sounds genuinely interdisciplinary, the type of project we're looking to encourage more of in the university.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, the problem is a very interesting and complicated one. Potentially, I think there's a lot of room for other bits of decision science, for some behavioral sciences. So I'm really interested in it. I mean, actually, there's a good segue across to some of your interests in creativity, because security and security operations is an area where actually there are large amounts of sort of operational creativity. And so some real interesting scope for the play of the sort of things that you're interested in from a disciplinary point of view.
That sounds interesting. We did do some work 15 years ago with some security researchers in another university, looking at how we can introduce creativity to explore unforeseen threats. So happy to go back to that.
In some senses, protective security is very much about discipline, rigor, caring management, and so on. But the more opportunistic side of security, getting one up on adversaries, is a very strongly creative component, because what you're trying to do is do things that an adversary would not imagine you are capable of doing, that's sort of beyond their imaginative scope.
Indeed. So as I said in the introduction, you worked in government for more than 5 years. How did that come about?
Well, I mean, I'd always known that the UK government had these chief scientific advisor roles. I mean, now more people are aware of it because of their involvement in the COVID crisis. So I was always aware of that, and I'd always sort of thought in the back of my head, wow, those seem like interesting roles. And I certainly had a sort of public service itch that I thought I might want to scratch. And then the opportunity came up, and I always say that I gave it mature consideration for about 5 milliseconds, which by my standards is quite a long time, and said, yeah, what the hell? I mean, then there was quite a lengthy process, but it seemed like the right thing. And the fact was that it also landed just at the right point in my career. I'd done quite a lot of sort of traditional management roles, and I was quite interested in the idea of how you might get things done using influence rather than sort of the traditional sort of tools of management. And this was an opportunity to do precisely that.
So there is a widespread and perhaps unfair perception that governments cannot create or innovate as effectively as other types of agency. You've been in government during some very interesting times. Do you think that lazy perception is fair?
I think the picture is much more complicated than that simple characterization. On the one hand, government can be extraordinarily creative in the operational moment when, DEFRA are confronted with flooding, or people in health are confronted with a global pandemic, or when the militaries are confronted with a changed defense situation. All of these things. You see actually people deploy tremendous amounts of creative and innovative capacity. But when it comes to institutional innovation and systems creativity and innovation, things tend to gum up. And the barriers to that are skills, they are institutional blockers, they are cultural blockers, and there are complex political constraints that operate. So I'd say there are two domains, and tremendous creativity at the sharp end and a degree of stasis at the back end.
Is it fair to say that a lot of that front-end creativity is often delivered by local government mayors because they're closer to the situations where you might have flooding or some outbreak of mad cow disease or something? Is that fair or not?
I'm not sure that it's about the nature of government. I mean, the immediacy of the challenge and the direct responsibilities of people to act on those challenges is what counts. So I'm not sure that it's local versus, Whitehall. It's more to do with, in the operational moment, people are licensed to be creative. And then when it comes to this larger picture, they feel they are more constrained.
You did list quite a large number of types of constraints on creativity and innovation a few minutes ago. Does that paint a rather bleak picture for innovation in government in the future? Because it would require at least a degree of overcoming of many of these challenges, and they feel generational to me.
So firstly, knowing me for a long time, you know that basically I'm a glass half full person. I'm constitutionally optimistic. So I don't think that some of these things are without the possibility of change. So I think that we can change structures and institutions. We can upskill individuals. We can change political discourse and so on. So I do think that some of those things are possible. It's a slow, but it's a steady march towards improving things. I very much share your belief that tools and methods and improved scientific understanding will yield progress. I'm not a pessimist.
Okay. So being optimistic and drawing on your experience of those 5 or 6 years in government, what kinds of innovation, or perhaps what kinds of innovation strategies should governments be looking to implement to be more successful? Have you got a feel of that?
Oh, gosh, a range of things. I mean, the first thing to say is actually, I think training helps. That makes a difference. I think building a network of key senior stakeholders for this who have an understanding of the issues helps. I think that there are innovations in terms of structural things and in terms of how budgets are managed. That can make a difference. I mean, one of the large constraints for innovation in government is actually how budgeting operates. I think that some of the mechanisms like sort of so-called engine B type innovations or sort of challenger type innovations where you spin out an activity into an external entity, I think that helps. I think there's a lot of things that can be done with also bringing external organizations in different ways. So I think there's quite a lot that can be done. All the stuff around prizes and rewards and incentives obviously makes a big difference. And I'm not also averse to, a little bit of top-down creative destruction. I think that often has an effect. So
may come later.
Good. Okay.
At the top of your list, you said improved training. Would that be training to make people more aware of their creative potential, of what innovation actually is, rather than some mythical view of it? Or is it something more domain specific in your view? Or is it both?
I think a little bit of both. I think that I have seen in government, for example, people receiving training in methods for agile innovation and for managing that process, which have yielded significant benefits. I think as a result, people are better. I think that people get better with practice and with the introduction of new tools, both digital and conceptual. So yes, I think that's a way of improving things.
And I've heard you say in the past that governments can be poor at what you've called structural innovation. Do you believe that the kinds of change that you've just articulated are a means or potential means to overcome some of the problems with structural innovation that sticks over time?
Yes, it's the challenge of how do you bridge between the sharp-end innovation I described and making quite sure that things persist, that they are diffused across a large organization, that they're adapted and enhanced, that learning is continually fed back. So I think a fairly standard model is that somebody somewhere introduces a new approach, a new method, a new tool, has a new idea, and they develop it, and it's used locally for a while, but it never receives the investment or innovation, or it's never diffused, it's never raised to the institutional level. The surrounding systems infrastructure you need to get these things to be successful isn't built, and after a while it dies out. Or another mode that things happen is that a small innovation unit is set up, they innovate, they get things done, but the funding runs out. They're not well plugged into the remaining units. And that's a really common mode across government. It's local, the key person responsible for it moves on, and things run into the ground.
And I'm really sensing your glass full view that there's quite a lot of, maybe not low-hanging fruit, but fruit that can be reached with directed investment and planning in government.
Without question. I mean, there's a lot of the stuff that needs doing on this is not rocket science. And indeed, there are also, models. both within the UK and actually there are global models which can be drawn on to improve things. So one of the things that I did when I was in government was to use strategic venture capital within government as a way of bringing innovation in from outside. And that's actually a whole range of things. That's actually directly importing technology. It's supporting the UK ecosystem, but it's also bringing different kinds of actors to the table. And there's a virtuous circle between government as first customer and startups bringing new innovation to the table and creative possibilities. So there are mechanisms like that can be used. And that was basically a copy in the UK of a successful US model, adjusted for the different UK financial and other structures.
Fascinating. It does make you think. Do you think there are useful parallels between your time in government and trying to bring about change in higher education, how we innovate within our own sector?
For definite, yes. You know, some of the things I said earlier about innovation which happens locally but doesn't make its way into more structural and systemic innovation. So, you know, the classic example that somewhere in a corner, somebody develops a course which comprises a degree of novel innovation and does things in a slightly different way, but it remains local. There are larger benefits and lessons from that don't trickle up and so on, and rather we get things constrained. So I think there are ways in which we could really address that.
Do we see City University of London as an interesting test bed for some of these ideas over the next few years?
Well, as you know, I'm inclined to innovation. My risk threshold is high. I like giving things a whack, and I'm not that afraid also of failing, or, you know, on some of those things, obviously. So definitely, we're really well placed, you know, institutionally to innovate. One of the challenges, and this is true also in all the organizations, which is what you have to do is create the space for innovation. If you're so busy pedaling hard on the immediate things that there isn't the space to innovate and create and fail, then you've got a problem. So, I mean, this is true actually of government and universities, that in order to innovate, you've got to create space. I think that often organizations really need what I call the Marie Kondo moment. It's basically, she's sort of expert on tidying up, and she has a whole philosophy built around this idea of tidying up. And the idea is that you take everything out of your cupboards and then you look at each thing and you go, does it fully emotionally satisfy me? Do I love it? And if the answer to that is no, you thank it for its service and you put it in the bin. Somehow what you do is it clears the mental space and allows you then to do new things. Now, she's got a much more emotional and elevated philosophy of what that's about. But many big organizations just need a Marie Kondo moment when they take everything out of the box and look at it and go, does this give us the emotional and other return that it should? And if not, we say thank you and dispose of it. And, you know, I think quite often, as in universities, you know, you need to take all of those programs and modules and practices and policies out of the box and look at them and go, are they things we're really, you know, emotionally committed to? Are they still contributing to our mission and our values and everything like that? And if not, we'll say they were great. They were great in their time. They did a really good job for us. That program was excellent. But now it's gone. And then you create that mental space where you can be, let's be honest, you know, a resource and other space where you can do that. And so I think there's something to take from that. But on the other hand, Marie Kondo says that you should stack your T-shirts vertically, and that's quite frankly bonkers. No, it's bonkers.
Mine fall over. Mine are not that well starched, as you said. So for our readers who are unfamiliar with Marie Kondo, we'll put in some links and examples in the show notes. I never thought I'd say that. My academic life. Going back to your time in government, You mentioned the example of the strategic capital investment based on an existing US model as one example. Do you think generally we lack enough examples of how, or case studies perhaps is the word I'm looking for, of how governments can innovate effectively?
Yes, I think that is the case. Maybe some of that is a little bit about we do it successfully and locally, and we don't champion them as models and put the innovation around those things. I don't think this is purely a UK issue. I think this may be more broader, which is an issue of timescales. I mean, institutional change and innovation takes time, but sometimes the political and funding timescales are much shorter. And that means that things don't happen that should. I think that some of the models that we see of successful government innovation have taken necessarily 10, 12, 15 years to be effective. Those are timescales that are certainly longer than the cycle of one minister. They're longer than the cycle of even of government's longer budget cycles, let alone an annualized budget cycle. So patience, interesting to think about this. You provoked me to this. In some ways, we have built in the rapid cycling, workshop it to, all of that stuff. But actually, of course, true innovation and creativity often takes a long amount of time to really bed in as you evolve and change and as the system coheres around your innovation and all of those things. Understanding that is also really important. Probably that particular innovation is one of the things I'm very proud of, that work. And it wasn't just mine, it was a whole series of people. We've got reason to be justifiably proud. It would be very difficult to really judge it for 12, 15 years.
Which makes it hard for us to talk about meaningful examples and case studies that can be published and shared in the traditional ways. They are just so vast. And
yeah, also it might suggest that we need to look a bit further back and look at things which we go, are working now, and seem like they're just part of the fabric, but actually these were at the moment innovation. So those things which have really survived and become institutionalized, we perhaps cease to think of them as what they were, which is quite sharp innovations at the time that they were introduced. So it'd be interesting to reflect on those things.
Indeed. Are there any obvious examples of projects that you can think of which were successful 15, 20 years ago, which we now take for granted, even though they were creative at the time?
Gosh, it's, that's quite an, my inability to immediately answer that question is actually really indicative of the earlier discussion, that it's quite difficult to pull those things out because they seem somehow so much part of what we always do. So I think, for example, in the business school domain, looking at academia, the specialist master's degrees in business topics were actually quite a sharp innovation at the time those were introduced. And now we just think of those as being part of the general scene. We also always underestimate how long these things take to bed in. I remember I did my first online digital teaching 20 years ago. May have been even more, but certainly 20 years ago on something that was called LiveNet. It was an ISDN network across the colleges of the University of London. I taught human-computer interaction, actually, I think. And only now we're still sort of thinking of it as something that's embedding. So really sensitivity to timelines is important.
That's an interesting problem to take back to some of my colleagues in the Bayes Business School to reflect on that. There's possibly work out there that I'm unfamiliar with.
The front end of the innovation process happening, and then somehow us not being sufficiently aware of the length of the process which then succeeds that for innovation to really embed is important. And it may be that as people who share an interest in that area, we're a little bit responsible for that, of not thinking about the long haul, because we're people who like the idea generation, synthesis, all of those sort of things.
No, it's interesting because within CBA, it's very much a project to deliver knowledge exchange. So we are in from at least the medium haul, if not the long haul. And I do sometimes sense that frustration because that's not the way I'm engineered. Earlier on, you mentioned creative destruction. So I have to ask, I suspect you worked with Dominic Cummings when you were in government. You were there at the same time. And he clearly sees himself as a creative renegade, a person who's there to challenge the status quo. Do you think in your experience there's a role for such creative individuals in government?
I think there absolutely is a role for that sort of individual in government. Downing Street has an immense convening and energizing capability. So having people there who are dedicated to that is immensely powerful. And there've been, in government, a small network of political advisors and others who played that role. And I think that's an immensely important role for government to have. This is not to comment on any of the politics or any of the question of method or manner, but is simply to say that creative individuals of all stripes have a really important role. And when you have those people in positions of influence and power, albeit briefly, they can get a tremendous amount done. And I recall the first time I met Dom Cummings, I met him in Cabinet Room in Downing Street. And it's a beautiful, rather elegant room looking out on Horse Guards. And he said, look at this, unchanged since the 18th century. Is this the way that we should be doing modern government? Is this the decision-making environment of the 21st century and people sitting there making vastly important decisions for our futures? Is this the best we can do in the 21st century? I've got to admit, I thought, yes, that is the sort of question which we should be asking. And his passion about how government should be done and his willingness to question those things, albeit in a very particular style on which I don't want to comment on, but I do want to say how amazing and refreshing when I confronted that, I found that voice. And it's one I recognize from somewhat iconoclastic colleagues who often are sort of right on the essence.
Yeah, I know. So the role for creative disruptors in all kinds of organizations, including governments, is there. It should be supported, and somehow it's difficult to think if it becomes more normalized, is it still a creative disruptor?
There's obviously, you have room for all sorts of different characters. And I think there's a question mark as to whether or not in government we have quite the right mix of personality and skills we need. I mean, there are so many brilliant people I worked with, skilled in all sorts of amazing ways, technically skilled in management and in building consensus and in arriving at complex programs of activity and seeing those through. Those people are absolutely necessary in large numbers and at the most senior levels. But is that the totality of what's needed? I'm not sure it is.
No, of course not. Maybe there's another podcast to be had around developing what is needed, but I'm conscious of the time, and it's been fascinating to talk to you, Anthony, on these subjects.
These are really interesting topics about which I feel passionately.
Of course. So just to wrap up our podcast, at CBA, we like to build technology that we hope can support creative problem solving using tools that people can use every day, more ideas, more often, form of creativity on demand, if you like. So we usually wrap up each podcast by testing your creativity, Anthony, in this case, your creativity on demand with 3 questions. And here goes. We're looking for short, sharp answers. The first is, what is the most important thing you need in order to be creative?
A fountain pen.
A fountain pen. Excellent. Thank you. If you could create any new tech or app that could do anything real or imaginary, what would it be?
Gosh, that's a really interesting question. So for me, the biggest personal challenge is to stop me looking down at my tech and help me to look up. So I think I need something which helps me with the looking down and looking up.
And for deliberate integrative thinking, that's something we could maybe get a student project to look at. I like that.
That sounds good. I like that term, deliberative integrative thinking.
Oh, it's academic, isn't it? We can come up with these all day. And my third question is, if you could remove one thing from the world to make people more creative, what would it be?
If I could remove one thing from the world to make people more creative, what would it be? PowerPoint.
You're not the first person to have said that. There's a movement here. PowerPoint will go, an integrative thinking app, and along with fountain pens.
Perfect. That makes me, a whole combination of those things makes me feel like a terrible old fart. And like I'm not a computer scientist who loves tech, which I am. So it's we quite know how
we love good tech, Anthony. We love good tech. That's the important thing.
Yeah, maybe that's a confession. Maybe I like.
We apologise to any listeners, but anyway, Microsoft. Yeah. So, Anthony, it's been lovely to talk to you. One last question: what's next for you on the innovation front?
What's next for me on the innovation front? Oh, definitely helping City to be really differentiated in a very homogenized higher education sector. How can we do that?
Looking forward to being part of that with you. And if any of our listeners want to find any more about you and your work, is there a particular place that they can go?
Finkelstein.uk, and all my papers are there, and a bit of personal profile and everything like that too. Or my blog, Prof Serious. There's a current blog and there's historic blogs, and you can find out more than you would wish to know.
We shall put that in the show notes for those that are serious Finkelstein fans. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking time to talk to us today. It's been fascinating.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you to everyone for listening to the Creative Tech podcast from CBAE. Check the show notes for links and any other stuff we've talked about today. And please take time to like the podcast and leave a review. It really does make a difference. You can follow us on Twitter at CBAE Center. That's CEBAI Center. Or on LinkedIn, Creativity Enabled by AI.